One of the things that's being talked about for this package, this stimulus package, relief package, I prefer a relief package to a stimulus package. Again, we'll talk more about that later. But one of the debates is over what companies should be bailed out or provided with relief. Should the oil and gas industry be among them? Our first guest today, Daniel Turner, Executive Director of Power the Future, argues yes, they absolutely should. And he joins us now. Daniel, welcome to Jimmy at the Crossroads. It is such a pleasure to talk with you. And visually this time, we've done a few radio hits before here in Denver, where I broadcast from. It's good to have a face conversation now as well.
Same. Thanks for having me on. It's been great being on your radio show. Congrats on this platform, and great to be with you. I wouldn't call it a bailout, but yes, I would say that the industry needs some support right now, no doubt.
Explain why you wouldn't call it a bailout.
Well, because I think a bailout brings with it the connotation that there were market problems at stake, right? You offered an inferior product, your competitor made a better product at a better price point. That's not happening right now. What's happening is the demand is clearly suppressed because of coronavirus. We have very few jets flying. We have no cruise ships leaving. Even though oil is low, you would think people would be driving, but we're being asked to stay at home. So there is a demand there's a huge problem with demand, so there's a huge supply. But the real reason why the price point is so low is because of this intentional price war between the Saudis and the Russians, who have wanted to drive us out of the petrochemical business for the last decade, and they are successful at it right now.
See, here's the reason why I could get on board with this. Now, I'm not a guy who likes subsidies. I don't think that we should have subsidies for any industry, basically, and certainly in normal times. In this instance, we're not necessarily talking about subsidies straight up. We're talking about maybe loans, or depending on how the government would go about it. And as you said, Daniel, because this is a broader crisis of coronavirus primarily, as well as a pricing war going on between Russia and Saudi Arabia, it does make some sense to say, look, this is not that industry's fault, and therefore it's not a bailout. It also is relief instead for these economic pressures that particularly result from coronavirus. In fact, I think that what's going on with Saudi Arabia and Russia is much more about coronavirus than anything else at this point, too, with what we're seeing in the oil market. So I think that there's a case to be made there. The question is, what kind of support should the industry be provided, as well as maybe some other industry?
Well, I wrote an article in Real Clear Energy last week where I presented a couple options that the president has. I think the first one, which may sound a little extreme, is I would ban the import of all oil right now. We only import very little oil, and the majority of it comes from Canada, about 50%, and then about 20% of it comes from Mexico. So there is a small percentage of oil that we get still from the Russians, who we import about 300,000 barrels a day, and equal amount from the Saudis. There is no reason for us right now to be importing Middle Eastern oil or oil from Russia. There's no reason to import oil from Russia, period. Russia's not a friend of ours. They're not an ally. And we have to find that supply somewhere else. And we could find it here in America because we have a tremendous amount of oil and gas under our feet if people were allowed to just responsibly explore and produce it.
Well, here's my issue with that particular approach is if a company here in the United States wants to freely exchange with Russia or Mexico or Canada or wherever else for a product, including oil, I think that I don't see the reason why we should say, no, you're actually denied the ability to do that, especially since you've been doing that in the past. So what do you say to a free marketeer like me who's thinking, I'm not such a big fan of banning imports, just as I'm not a fan of the trade war that President Trump is engaged in vis-a-vis China, Daniel Turner?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I am a free market believer myself. But for the free markets to work, you need people on both sides who are engaging in the same sense of freeness and fairness and honest competition. And the decision between the Saudis and the Russians right now is not a market decision. It's a political decision, and political decisions need to be responded to with political actions. And so people would say, you may argue, well, this doesn't sound like it's free trade, but what it really sounds like is we need a stronger foreign policy when it comes to these agents, these foreign agents who are acting in a way that's trying to sink our economy. And this is just oil and gas. We can point to other countries, particularly China, that are trying to sink our economy in other economic ways.
So let me ask you about what's being discussed more in Congress, because I haven't heard this particular approach that you're suggesting bandied about, especially with the economic package that's being debated right now in the United States Senate. Right now, we're seeing the idea of no interest loans being discussed, this fund that
Mm.
Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, might get in order to disperse funds as support money to various industries. You didn't mention that. Are you favorable to including oil and gas among those who would get support from the federal government in this particular package? Or are you strictly looking at the idea of banning imports from other countries?
No, no, no. I mean, in my op-ed and in my personal belief, there are a number of things the president can do. I mentioned the first, but absolutely a second thing the president could do is help with financial support, which is really in covering short-term covering loans. And look, when you explore oil and gas, you're a guy from Colorado, you know the industry well. There is a tremendous amount of capital in the billions that goes into procuring the land, leasing. There are legal environmental restrictions and fees. You have to hire personnel. You've got to move equipment, right? So there is so much overhead sunk into this industry that when it is beyond a profitable price point, which is where we are way below a profitable price point. You're going to start seeing companies default on their loans, and so a short term, and I like to call it a bridge loan, right? It's not a saving an industry that is dying. It's not saving a product in a marketplace that doesn't want it. It is dealing with a short-term crisis, really a government-made crisis, because it is the government
Yes.
that is not allowing the industry and not allowing the consumer, us, to use their product. And so the government could provide some support.
That's where I think this discussion about providing support bridge loans, as you put it, Daniel Turner, again, executive director of Power of the Future, our guest, in terms of giving aid, giving support to these
Mhm.
companies, including oil and gas, because it is not their fault that we have the coronavirus crisis right now and that government is shutting down so many different economic activities around the country, which as a result is also depressing the purchase of oil in our country, oil as well
Yeah.
as gas, because what you're seeing is a lot of companies that are not operating, that are not having their workers come to work, so they're not buying gasoline as much at the pump. So it does make sense that oil and gas would fall under that. And then you made a very important point, which is that this industry is not one that is failing. In fact, the United States has become, just in the last couple of years, a net exporter of oil and gas, which is a sign of strength of our own industry. And if a company is failing because of government policies and because of this kind of crisis that has absolutely nothing to do with the underlying value of the product or how that company has been operating, then it makes abundant sense to say, okay, that's an industry that could
Mhm.
get some sort of support during this difficult time, and especially if it's in the form of a no interest bridge loan that then you say you have to repay pretty darn quickly after the crisis abates.
Yeah, and if I could link two things that you said
Sure.
just now, and if I could link them together, you said that as a free market person, you aren't in support of subsidies, you don't like subsidies, and you talked about a product that isn't failing. Well, let's tie that to what the Democrats, what Nancy Pelosi has tried to put into the stimulus relief package, which is huge amount of, really, you could call it a bailout, but they call it investments or they call it tax incentives for the solar and wind and renewable industry, right? These industries would not survive without government subsidies, and they aren't in the huge demand that their proponents claim that they are. And that is why, interesting in this time of crisis, what is holding up, one of the sticky points that's holding up this legislation from passing is a tremendous amount of tax credits and tax breaks for wind and solar. It just really flies in the face of free markets and common sense.
One thing I'm seeing liberals talk about is the idea of not picking winners and losers in this crisis, as far as, say, this fund that Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, may have created under the auspices of the Department of the Treasury or through other avenues. It is interesting hearing them say that, yet they do want to pick winners and losers because, as you point out, Daniel Turner of Power of the Future, it is the case that right now you have a lot of industries that may get support that were not succeeding without subsidies on their own 2 feet, yet this crisis is impacting those companies and those industries that were doing pretty darn well before this particular crisis. And so you are picking winners and losers effectively
Yeah.
when you're saying we're going to give these industries that are not succeeding on their own merit support, but we don't want to give support to those industries that were doing well but are not right now because of this crisis and because of government policy reactions to it.
Exactly. And with these subsidies, these tax breaks for the renewable industry, at the expense of support of our American domestic energy industry, 85 to 90% of the wind and solar industry is based in China. So when you talk about giving tax breaks to people who are buying wind power, solar panels, wind turbines, really what you're saying is let's send more money to China. And if they couched it in those honest terms, I wonder how successful this package would actually be.
Uh, Daniel, what do you make of the politics of all this? Because in Washington, D.C., right now, we have seen delays on this legislation. Now I feel that it's getting worse after the Democrats have gotten their hands on adding to it. I already wasn't a big fan of many of the components of the particular package, but right now we've seen a lot of political games played over the past few days, whether we get a deal or not today, and it does look like there's a likely deal to be made in the matter of hours, perhaps, at least according to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. How do the politics play out in your view, or how are they playing out right now and impacting this legislation?
I think one of the interesting things coming out of the coronavirus crisis when this is done, and I hope it's done soon. And of course, we mourn the loss of life and the suffering of many people, but we will come out of this. But one of the things I think Americans will learn is how cumbersome and inept government actually is. And I applaud the president and government leaders who are trying their best in this moment. But look at what president has done in terms of foregoing a lot of the normal regulations so the CDC can work on vaccines quicker so that companies can produce masks and ventilators quicker. It makes you wonder, why were all these blockades in there to begin with? Why was the EPA, which has now given permission for a number of new disinfectants that can kill the coronavirus, why was the EPA stopping it to begin with, right? So you wonder if, because of the fact that tens of thousands of bureaucrats are literally forced to stay at home and not at their desks stamping bills and saying, no, you can't do that, I didn't give you permission, what does government do for us on a regular basis? And I think a lot of Americans are seeing, wow, when it comes to my day to day, government really, it just makes life expensive, complicated, slow, and without it, we can move a lot more quickly.
Daniel Turner, our guest, Executive Director of Power of the Future. Excuse me, just a couple minutes left with you. And I think that the point that you raise is a very salient one, but I wonder the extent to which the American people who are simultaneously looking to government for aid are
Mm.
comprehending the point that you're making, understanding that government impediments are making it more difficult while simultaneously looking to them for aid.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm not an anarchist, right? I tend to dislike big government, as most conservatives do. And I have a bit of a fear of the power that government has. And I would hate for this piece of legislation that's working through the House and the Senate to take away more of my individual rights and give it to government, which is kind of what people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer like. But hopefully, Americans will understand that government necessarily isn't the answer, and they'll also return to federalism. We're seeing some governors step up to the plate in great ways, and people are saying, wow, look at how successful this governor is being. Even Governor Cuomo and Governor Gavin Newsom, who aren't necessarily friends of the president, are working in coordination with him. And maybe the citizens of California and New York, and I'm a New Yorker, maybe these two great liberal states will realize, boy, maybe we should have more local control and have DC have less power. And if DC becomes less powerful as a result of this, the world will be a better place and I'll be a happier person, that's for sure.
I certainly hope you're right, because I agree that the federal government's much too big, and looking to states to address these issues is certainly much better. And if that lesson is getting across, at least there are some silver linings to a crisis then when you get some lessons learned. Daniel Turner, Executive Director of Power of the Future, thanks so much for joining us on Jimmy at the Crossroads today. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Jimmy. Congrats on the show and happy to be on with you.
All right, thank you. Once again, Daniel Turner joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, Executive Director of Power the Future. Some very important salient points that Daniel made in our conversation about lessons learned. Now, I am not on board with the idea of an import ban, but I do think that providing support for industries that are struggling as a result of this crisis is of value and note, particularly because it's the result of this crisis, and you want to keep workers. The Heritage Foundation has done a great job making this point. You want to keep workers tied to their jobs and not reliant simply upon the government. Now, I do believe that we should expand unemployment insurance to furloughed workers right now, but that isn't the same thing as saying we shouldn't be encouraging workers to remain part of their company. if you can give support for these businesses, particularly to keep workers on their payrolls, especially to keep them in operation if they are eligible for operation, but maybe, that is to say, a lot of states are shutting people down and saying you're not essential and therefore you're not able to go to work. Now we see Denver, Colorado. Denver, Colorado has joined in as a city on this. It looks like my home city of Aurora, Colorado will get involved in stay-at-home orders, but Governor Jared Polis here has not taken that initiative. So at least up to this point, it may happen in the future. But then you look at New York and California and Michigan, where stay-at-home orders are much more expansive. They are statewide. We're seeing them play out. So states are taking their own initiatives, but as a result, there are certain industries and businesses that cannot work because they're lacking customers, even if they qualify for essential, or they are considered non-essential. And being able to provide some support for those industries makes some rational sense to me. It's also how you do it, though. And I am worried about the idea that you have the Treasury Secretary with unilateral authority to go ahead and dole out $500 billion to various industries and companies of his own accord. There is some concern to have about that, but providing no interest loans to businesses does make sense, particularly if they are deprived of income, of capital, to even keep their employees working and what have you, or on their payroll because of this crisis.